Hello everyone. I would like to start by thanking the organizers for putting together such a timely conference. My essay today looks at the intersections of indigenous knowledge and climate change adaptation in Usman Khan's novel Thinner Than Skin. Humanity owes its very existence to glaciers since they have been here during 2 million years of human history and have created landscapes, determined soil composition, and controlled the atmospheric and oceanic circulations that drive global weather systems. The rapacity of global colonial terraforming of utilitarian landscapes for capitalist profit has driven Earth ecologies and ecosystems into a state of anthropogenic disruption. A similar case is seen in Pakistan, where the enhanced global warming is decreasing frozen water reserves and expanding geohazards. This is a critical situation for the country, given that these glaciers are enormous reservoirs of fresh water and their meltwater is an important resource that feeds major rivers in Pakistan. Rapid glacial decline is posing serious challenges to water security, shifting the snow line and causing upward migration of animals and plant species, thus highlighting the need to understand the political, cultural, and epistemological aspects of glaciers. Focusing on this climatic emergency, Usman Khan's novel Thinner Than Skin, which was published in 2012, depicts the ongoing endangerment of glaciers and the nomadic Gujar community as observed by the protagonist Nadir in his journey to photograph the majestic mountains of Kagan, which are based in northern Pakistan. The text underscores the spatial temporal reach of glacial melt. Quote, glaciers in the eastern Himalayas are receding. Some say the Alps will be ice-free by the 21st century. Greenland's glaciers are melting so fast they could sink southern California in Bangladesh, end quote. This quote highlights the planetary scope of the problem. However, the novel does not offer broad generalizations about climate breakdown, but offers a nuanced explication by contextualizing the glacial melt within Kagan Valley and by highlighting the ways that the indigenous community addresses the anthropogenic induced glacial melt. In this regard, the paper argues that Thinner Than Skin is an important post-colonial climate fiction that rejects climate as object and instead frames it as climate as condition. This is a term that Harriet Buckley has theorized that I'm building upon in this essay. And she defines climate as condition as an epistemic reframing of climate change which moves beyond its normative conceptions as an external phenomena out there to quote a condition that gives rise to an unfolding set of processes and dynamics, end quote. In doing so, we become more attuned to the multiple, diverse, and complex aspects of climate change and start to see it in a more relational manner. Such a relational perspective also opens up the whereabouts of quote climate politics in relation to multiple socio-material realities to enable new forms of dialogues about the ethics of different kind of futures, end quote. Khan's novel figures as an important example of this epistemic reframing, as will be established through the textual exposition of the transformation of the Kagan Valley into a resource frontier that causes ecological rupture and glacial decline in the region. To understand climate as condition requires an understanding of its causality vis-a-vis capitalist development as depicted in the novel Thinner Than Skin. This development entails a conversion of the Kagan Valley and the Himalayan region into a resource frontier through, quote, the commodification and privatization of the eco-commons for capital gain, end quote. This transformation becomes evident in the ways that the Kagan Valley and the mountain ranges become co-opted for capital-intensive state and corporate investments. A notable example in this regard is the establishment of a Norwegian water management company and the questioning of the project's overall feasibility by a local engineer, Irfan, who reflects that quote. If for thousands of years people had survived with varying degrees of success by building irrigation channels from glacial melt, despite their poverty and isolation, did they need a man from the city bringing them pipes and taps, end quote? This critique highlights the privatization of natural resources for profit maximization, thereby highlighting the ecological rupture caused by capitalist modernization. Land commodification also occurs through species manipulation, as reflected in the state-sponsored plan of replacing local Kagan and Killen goats with foreign Australian sheep to be reared for international trade. The text depicts the disastrous impact of this thoughtless development on local herders, since Australian sheep cannot withstand the extreme climate, deplete existing food supplies, and leave indigenous goats bleating in hunger. To feed their goats, the nomads must undergo more physical exertion to find new food sources, because of which they inadvertently trespass into protected areas and are consequently subject to harassment and heavy fines by the authorities. This textual example highlights the dispossession and poverty that results from the state's co-optation of the ecological commons for wealth accumulation. Another instance of resource frontier expansion is the construction of a new international trade route connecting China, Central Asia, and Pakistan. While this infrastructural project promises wealth accumulation for the state, it further displaces and disenfranchises indigenous people. Quote, some believe it will give us work. But when the work is done, lamented Nursha, what will become of us without our homes, without our past, end quote. Through this textual exposition, readers are made aware of how natural space is co-opted and transformed for infrastructural development, but this project only serves a capital-intensive state while exacerbating socio-economic dispossession for indigenous people. All these examples also show how the ecological commons are increasingly subject to the logic of capitalist transition and transform into resource frontiers, which offer wealth accumulation but at the cost of intensified, quote, environmental displacement and development-induced displacement, end quote. Reading these examples in conjunction allows us to see the acceleration of resource frontier creation through more scaled-up economic, political, and technological arrangements to extract resources in peripheral areas like Kagan. These arrangements are made possible through land grabbing, deforestation, soil cover removal, machine use, and species displacement, which lead to erasure of carbon sinks, which are natural resources that hold carbon dioxide and prevent it from being released into the atmosphere, and thus increase carbon dioxide emissions, which in turn enhances climate destabilization. This climate destabilization in turn accelerates glacial melt, as seen in the novel's accounts of glaciers that, quote, weathered global gas emissions and whose decline were indicators of global warming, end quote. This glacial melt in turn could lead to other geohazards such as outburst floods, avalanches, landslides, and decreased water supply, which would threaten the nomads' pastoral livelihood. Anticipating these geohazards, the Gujar community used traditional ecological knowledge, which is built upon prior experience and functions as both dynamic and cumulative knowledge that helps the community to adapt to climate change. Countering the logic of controlling nature through enclosure, the Gujars instead move and live across different topographies, thereby partaking in what Michel Levier calls unsettling mobility. This kind of mobility denotes a movement that emplaces people on the lands across which they move. The text recounts itinerant movement as an identity marker of the Gujar community, who are believed to have ridden down to Kagan and now spend their summers in the mountain pastures and winters down in the plains. Mariam also recalls that, quote, her earliest memories were of movement. On horseback, in her father's arms, on her brother's back. What she did know was that theirs had always been a fight for mobility. They could only be governed if they stayed. For every way of limiting movement, there was a way to move, end quote. This narrative account shows how the Gujar community's mobility and its embodied experience allows them to make places. In other words, to how they settle. Furthermore, this seasonal mobility and access to particular landscapes allows the Gujar nomads to escape state surveillance, to assert their cultural subjectivity, to adapt to the changing climate, and to use natural resources in a sustainable manner. With respect to indigenous belief systems, the novel delineates the religious meanings that the nomads attribute to the landscape. This can be seen in Mariam's spiritual connection with the mountain ranges of Kagan. Quote, Kagan had shrines devoted to her all over the valley, and that at one time her devotees had left her offerings in temples decorated with ram, horns, and yak tails. She knew that most of these shrines had now been abandoned and that Kagan's wrath was far worse than the jagged spear of the naked mountain, end quote. This instance shows the ways that Mariam, a local woman, venerates natural sentience as she recognizes that her community's existence is inextricably bound up in the prosperity delivered by the mountain and its surrounding ecosystems. Furthermore, this spiritual communion with nature becomes an important counter to materialist views of the environment, as seen in the resource frontier creation, supplanting it instead with, quote, relational ontology, whereby landscapes are perceived as animated and requiring reciprocal actions from local human inhabitants, end quote. This reciprocity would also entail due consideration of the mountain glaciers that are receding because of climate change. The awareness of climate change induced glacial melt also galvanizes the nomadic community to use an indigenous practice of ice mating to generate glacial growth. The text delineates the process as an ancient ritual which requires the selection of a male and female glacier that are sourced from different locations and then transported to a carefully selected mountain hole that would shield the glacier from sunlight and allow it to grow. Quote, the winter would help the snow collect around the two ice blocks. After 5 winters, the couple would begin to creep downhill as one, becoming a natural glacier, and the village would drink them and irrigate their fields with them, end quote. The author also documents the success of this ancient ritual, which has led to glacial growth in North Pakistan in some of the most isolated places on earth, and has helped indigenous communities like the Gujar nomads adapt to the water shortages and cryosocial disruption caused by climate change. In conclusion, an explication of the Gujar communal practices in Uzma Khan's novel emphasizes the importance of indigenous ecological knowledge in restoring human non-human reciprocity to work towards climate change adaptation. By doing so, the essay also establishes the significance of thinner than skin as post-colonial climate fiction that defies the climate disaster narrative, characterized by reductionism, loss-centric tendencies, and fixation on absolute and knowable endings. Additionally, the dominant doom and gloom narratives about climate change can prove counterproductive for climate action, as fear may demotivate climate action. Instead, Uzma Khan's novel emerges as a transformative narrative that frames climate as condition vis-a-vis the socio-material realities of the Gujar community to highlight the ongoing importance of human agency and responsibility in countering climate breakdown and ensuring multi-generational survival.